Okay, welcome to Star Views, and today it's a privilege and an honor to be here with Professor Avi Loeb. Avi Loeb has been chair of the astronomy department at Harvard University for 9 years, founding director of Harvard's Black Hole Initiative, director of the Institute for Theory and Computation at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Professor Loeb is a former member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology at the White House. He also chairs the advisory committee for the Breakthrough Starshot Initiative. In 2012, Time magazine selected Professor Loeb as one of the 25 most influential people in space. He is author of 8 books and hundreds of scientific articles. And Professor Loeb is the best-selling author of the book Extraterrestrial, The First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth. Welcome, Professor Loeb, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for hosting me.
Professor, I just finished your book, and it was a very compelling reading indeed. Thank you very much. And it has 2 elements in it. On the one side, there is the scientific element. On the other side, there is this autobiographical element. And the 2 lines, so to speak, converge to a single point, an event in time that is very important. And you can read this book as a novel pretty much, because it's, as you say in the book, a sort of detective story, to find out about this mystery of Oumuamua. So, like, these 2 lines converge on this point, which is a very clear-cut beginning date, October 19, 2017. So why is that date important, and what happened that date that is relevant to us, humankind?
Yeah, so on that day, a telescope in Hawaii named Pan-STARRS discovered the first object that came from outside the solar system in our vicinity, near the Earth. And it's sort of like the experience of finding an object from the street in your backyard. You can learn about what's going on out there from examining it without making the trip. And at first, astronomers thought that this object is probably like a comet or an asteroid, the type of rocks that we have seen within the solar system. This object was unbound to the sun. It was moving too fast to be bound to the sun. So maybe it came from another star, but of the same type as we have seen before. The object was given the name Oumuamua, which means a scout in the Hawaiian language. And then as we started collecting data, it definitely didn't look like a comet because it didn't have a cometary tail. And the Spitzer Space Telescope looked very carefully in its vicinity, couldn't detect any carbon-based molecules, so there was no dust. It was definitely not a comet of the type we have seen. And then, as it was tumbling, the amount of light that it reflected changed by a factor of 10 every 8 hours. And that was a very large factor, implying an extreme shape, most likely pancake-like, a flat shape. And as the object moved around the sun, it was affected by an excess push, another force in addition to the force of gravity that was pushing it away from the sun. And since there was no cometary evaporation and no rocket effect, the only explanation I could think of was the reflection of sunlight that gives it the push. It declined inversely with distance squared, just like you expect for reflection of sunlight. And in order for it to be effective, the object had to be very thin, sort of like a sail. And that's what led me to the suggestion in a scientific paper that maybe it is artificial in origin. And in September 2020, last year, there was another object discovered that exhibited an excess push from the sun by reflecting sunlight with no cometary tail. It was given the name 2020 SO and was discovered on the same telescope. The astronomers realized soon afterwards that it actually follows an orbit that indicates that it came from Earth. It was a rocket booster that was launched in 1966 to the moon. And we know why it was pushed by reflecting sunlight, because it had very thin walls and they had a large area for its mass. So we know that we produced 2020 SO artificially. The question is, who produced Oumuamua?
And do you have an answer for that? Did you think about a possible answer to that question?
Yeah, so the other unusual or property or anomaly of Oumuamua was that it came from a very special frame, the so-called local standard of rest, which is the local parking lot of the Milky Way galaxy, that you get to when you average over the random motions of all the stars in the vicinity of the sun. And this object was at rest in that frame, meaning that it didn't come from any of the stars near the sun, because otherwise it would have inherited their motion. Only 1 in 500 stars is so much at rest there. And it could be that the object is a member of a grid of objects sitting in the local standard of rest and being used for navigation purposes when you want to know your coordinates as you move through interstellar space. Or it could be a relay station for communication. But more recently, it occurred to me that it could also have served another purpose. Perhaps its flat shape and thin geometry was not because it was designed to be a light sail, but it was designed for a different purpose, to act as a receiver, to collect information. And as it was tumbling, it was trying to collect data from all directions. And as you know, the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies delivered a report to Congress on the 25th of June and yesterday, and in which there is evidence or discussion of objects that are not fully understood near Earth. And it's possible that there are probes. I mean, these objects are not likely to be human-made based on the way that they behave. We don't fully understand their nature. It could be that they originate naturally somehow, or that they are extraterrestrial in origin. So I think we should keep our eyes open on objects with unusual properties, and that includes searching for them in the sky, interstellar objects like Oumuamua that look strange, weird. They do not look like a comet or an asteroid. And then, if we detect one of those, we can get
others.
We can find many, and if we get an alert sufficiently in advance, we can send a spacecraft with a camera that will take a close-up photograph. And that could tell us if it's a natural object or an artificial object. And, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book. I wouldn't need to write the book if we had a photograph.
Professor, how was your hypothesis received in the scientific community? It's because it's a very strong hypothesis, like saying that this object is not natural but artificial in nature, so might be extraterrestrial. How was it received?
Well, it was there was a lot of pushback, but there were a number of scientists that considered the anomalies of Oumuamua and followed the scientific process and tried to explain them from a natural origin. And all of them had to contemplate something that we've never seen before. For example, a chunk of frozen hydrogen iceberg, so that when it evaporates, we don't see the cometary tail because hydrogen is transparent. And the problem with that is hydrogen evaporates very quickly, so such a chunk the size of a football field would not survive the journey through interstellar space. There was a suggestion maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg. Again, something we've never seen before. The problem is that the mass budget, there is just not enough solid nitrogen on the surfaces of planets like Pluto throughout the Milky Way that would provide a big enough population of chips such that one of them would be Oumuamua. There was a suggestion maybe it's a cloud of dust particles that are loosely bound, 100 times less dense than air. The problem with that is material strength. When it comes close to the sun and gets heated by hundreds of degrees, it will not have the strength to hold itself together to maintain its integrity. So there were suggestions for natural origin, but all of them talked about things that we've never seen before. And my point is simple. If we contemplate that, then we should definitely keep on the table the possibility that it's artificial as well. Because if you think about a caveman that is being presented with a cell phone, a caveman used to playing with rocks all of his life would argue that the cell phone is a shiny rock. And we don't want to be in that situation. We want to be open-minded and base our assertions scientifically on evidence. So this should simply intrigue us and encourage us to get better data in the future, rather than say it's always rocks, business as usual.
You say in your book, actually, you talk about a lot about modesty and humility, and keeping eyes like children, because they like they are able to maybe look outside the box, so to speak. In fact, there is a passage on your book that I liked very much, and you say, recall the clerics who refused to look through Galileo's telescope. The scientific community's prejudice or close-mindedness is particularly pervasive and powerful when it comes to the search of alien life, especially intelligent life. Why do you think the alien theory is so discredited and overlooked compared, for example, to other theories like the supersymmetry, extra dimensions, string theories that maybe are also unsupported with, evidence?
Right. So first, it takes people out of their comfort zone, scientists in particular, because the public is very fascinated with this subject, and there is a lot of literature on science fiction, and so scientists are reluctant to get into that discussion, and because it was not really part of the mainstream to start with. So there is resistance naturally for innovation and risk-taking. People are worried about their image and they want to maintain the same comfort zone that they had. But it goes beyond that. It threatens our ego to believe that we might not be the smartest kid on the block. And it's a much more comfortable position to basically close the curtains on our windows and not look out. But the point is that whether we have neighbors or not, whether our neighbors are smarter than we are or not, does not depend on whether we look through the window. That's a fundamental fact. And it's exactly what happened with Galileo when the philosopher refused to look through his telescope and argued that they know the answer, that the sun moves around the earth. And they put him in house arrest. Nowadays, they would cancel him on Twitter. The point is, reality doesn't really care whether we ignore it or not. It's to our benefit.
And yet it moves.
And yet it moves, exactly. The earth continues to move. And it's to our benefit to gain scientific knowledge. In fact, the way we act by not gathering evidence is not intelligent. I define an intelligent species as a civilization that follows the guiding principles of science, which is cooperation and sharing of evidence-based knowledge, rather than being trapped in convictions, in prejudice. And you would think that by now we would learn the lesson from history, from the history of Galileo. We haven't learned that history.
I live in Rome, near to Campo de Fiori, where, of course, Giordano Bruno was burnt at stake. And, like for me, was burnt at stake because maybe he was believing that there were a plurality of the world. So maybe we would call them today exoplanets. I don't know if there are exoplanets or not, because, that's my field and so on. But my sympathy goes always to Giordano Bruno rather than to the inquisitors. I wonder, Professor, who's winning this fight, this battle between heretics and inquisitors at the moment?
Well, so if you look at what science provided us with, Giordano Bruno made the very good points. He argued that other stars are like the sun. We now know that that's true. He argued that those stars may have a planet like the Earth. We now know that from the Kepler satellite that half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. So he was right on target that, in fact, Galileo made the point that we are not at the center of the universe, and then Giordano Bruno argued that we are not privileged in terms of what we find in our backyard. The Earth-Sun system are common. There are tens of billions of them, and he was right about that. And then he said maybe those planets have life. And that's what infuriated the church, in the sense that it implies that if those forms of life sinned, then Christ should have saved them, and you need the billions of copies of Christ to visit all these planets and save the life there from their sins. And that didn't sound reasonable, so they burned Giordano Bruno on the stake for that. Now, in modern science, you don't see situations like that where the mainstream burns someone on the stake, but you see views being cancelled, you see innovation being suppressed and ridiculed. And that's very unfortunate. The worst message that is being conveyed by doing that, by not, for example, discussing technological relics in space, is that the young people, the young scientists look at that and they worry about their job prospects, and they are afraid of thinking outside the box. And that's a very damaging impact on our ability to innovate, to make discoveries. And there are many examples throughout history where thinking outside the box was suppressed, including exoplanets. Otto Struve, an astronomer, wrote a paper in 1952 saying that we could search for a planet like Jupiter close to a star like the Sun, because it will move the star back and forth in a noticeable way, and also will block the light from the star if it passes in front of it. And that was ignored for 4 decades. And in 1995, it was discovered a Jupiter-like planet close to a star, a hot Jupiter. And the Nobel Prize was awarded for that a few years ago. And you might say, okay, well, this baby was born eventually. It was only delayed by 4 decades. But my point is, the argument that the astronomy community made was, we know why Jupiter is so far away from the Sun, and therefore we don't expect Jupiter to be close to their star, and therefore we shouldn't search for it. They sort of knew the answer before searching. And even though in this case someone actually did the experiment and discovered hot Jupiters, and that opened the whole field of exoplanets, there are many other cases where the baby was not born because it was suppressed all the way until now. And it's unfortunate. And I do believe that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence should be in the mainstream of science. And the reason there is opposition to it is partly out of arrogance. We prefer to believe that we are privileged, unique, and special, just like the philosophers in the days of Galileo thought that we are the center of the universe. And in addition to that, you have a culture of people that speculate about things that we will never see in our lifetime, like extra dimensions, the multiverse, the string theory landscape, and that's considered part of the mainstream. So you ask yourself, how is it possible you have that culture side to side with a culture that conservatively argues, give me extraordinary evidence, or else I don't want to discuss this subject? Well, there is a common thread between these cultures. Both of them do not pay attention to evidence. So the culture of people that work on the multiverse does not really need evidence in order to believe in what they are doing, and in order to use it as a sandbox to demonstrate that they are smart. That's the purpose. The purpose is to maintain a good image and demonstrate that you are smart, and not put skin in the game, not make predictions that can be tested or falsified by experiments. That's a very convenient spot to be in. Just as much as a convenient spot to be in is to say everything we find is something that we already know, and therefore Oumuamua must be a rock. There is no chance that it's something unusual as a piece of equipment. We don't want even to discuss that. So both cultures coexist because both of them do not respect evidence and are not intrigued by the attempt to gather more evidence. And that's unhealthy for science, because science is based on evidence. And when something unusual shows up, we should pay a lot of attention to it. It's a dialogue with nature. It's not a monologue. We're supposed to listen to nature telling us what reality is.
It looks like the military is going faster than the scientific community in this moment, because the Pentagon said, yes, they are real. We don't know what they are. They are often seen near nuclear or military sites. we need more time to investigate, and also we need more money to investigate. So what do you think about this report? What are they actually saying? Because also I've seen like many, some statement from public personalities like even Barack Obama or like senators saying, yes, they are, these things are real and we don't know what they are. They are behaving in very strange ways, speeding up to a point that we don't know what they do. So like they are technologically much more advanced than us. So, what is that about?
Well, much of the data that is being discussed in the report was collected only over the past couple of years. And it's clear that there is something going on that we don't fully understand. And the reason I'm saying that, and the report said that, is because some of the objects were detected by multiple instruments, infrared cameras, detectors, and optical cameras, and radar systems, and multiple pilots and military personnel that are highly trained. And that implies that it can't be the malfunction of a particular instrument. It can't be smudge on the camera. It can't be illusions of the pilots. And that's what makes these objects real. And then the question is, what's their nature? And if they behave in ways that exceeds the limits of our technologies. And I cannot imagine that there are humans capable of technologies that are far more advanced than we can imagine, because that would have huge financial implications in the consumer market. I mean, anyone that has access to such technologies would make a lot of money out of it, or it would appear in the battlefield. So if we see something behaving in an unusual way, and we don't know the nature, we should examine it scientifically. It could be either something natural in nature, or it could be extraterrestrial in origin. And both possibilities are very exciting for us to figure out. And instead of letting the government use classified sensors and instruments to collect the data, I think it should be open to the public. It should be a scientific exploration. We can deploy state-of-the-art cameras on wide-field telescopes and collect the data ourselves. And in a scientific project. And I'm very much, I would be happy to take part in such a project if the funding is secured. And the idea would be to collect open data that is being analyzed by computers and in a transparent way, so we can figure out what the nature of these objects is. And the first task is, of course, to try and understand the physical properties of these objects. And then, of course, there is the question of the intent. What, I mean, if they're not human-made, what is the meaning behind their actions, and what kind of information are they trying to collect? And then at some point, when we will get more data, it could make sense to engage with these objects and see what we find. And it may well be, if these are autonomous, let's just imagine the most exciting possibility. These are autonomous objects. They're probably not communicating with any extraterrestrial civilization right now, because the distances are so vast. It takes light 4 years to reach the nearest star. So they're probably on their own. And you can imagine artificial intelligence systems doing that. We are developing artificial intelligence right now that will supersede human abilities within a decade. It's evolving very fast. So I can imagine a system, an instrument, that equipment that has artificial intelligence, that learns from through machine learning, learns from experience, and makes its own intelligent decisions, and without any biological creature on it, or any, because those biological creatures would never survive travel through space. What you can imagine is equipment that is made of electronics and artificial intelligence, perhaps with 3D printers, so that the system can replicate itself, produce more copies. But pretty much it could be just a piece of equipment operating on its own. And of course, the fundamental question is what the purpose of such a thing is, and why is this thing here? And that's kind of questions that one can ask if indeed these objects are not natural and are not human-made.
You know, I wasn't surprised by the report of the Pentagon, except for one thing, actually. They talk about socio-cultural stigmas. Basically, they are saying that they could not investigate freely in the past because people were not talking freely about UFOs because they were not taken seriously. But now this has changed, and they're actually calling, you know, people to move forward and say what they see and so on forth and so on. But encouraged by your, you know, by you to ask provocative questions, I want to ask you this. So basically, if we look up at the sky with a telescope, we are not only looking into deep space, we are also looking back in time. If there is an ancient civilization and we might meet them somehow, I don't know when, and this encounter, I wonder maybe if this encounter already happened. And I explain myself because actually, if you take the ancient civilization literature from the Sumerian tablets to the Bible and to the Vedas, for example, there are flying objects all the time. For example, I have here a quote from the prophet Zechariah in the Bible that says, chapter 5, I looked again, and there before me was a flying scroll. He asked me, the angel, what do you see? I answered, I see a flying scroll. And you know, this also is in the book of Ezekiel, and all the time in the Bible you can find this kind of references. So would it be possible as a working hypothesis? I don't know that this encounter has already happened.
Well, definitely possible. The issue is that in order for me as a scientist to accept evidence, I want it to be collected by instruments, not through eyewitness testimonies. You know, and there is also the biblical story of Abraham hearing the voice of God telling him to sacrifice his only son. And if Abraham had a cell phone with a voice memo app, he could have pressed the button and recorded the voice of God. That would have been much more believable. Otherwise, if you just read the stories, you can't really tell if something real happened. Science is about reproducibility of results. And I think we have the technology, we have the instruments right now, and we should clear the fog. We should clarify the mystery. You know, we're in the 21st century. There is no room for a belief system that we inherited from the dark ages where you know the answers in advance and you have convictions. That's not the way to approach such matters. We should collect evidence, data on these objects and figure out what they are. And you know, as you say, we might learn from them because if we put our hands on a piece of technology that is, let's say, 1,000,000 years into our future, it will save us 1,000,000 years in development. And it may feel like cheating in an exam that you look over the shoulders of a student next to you to get the answer. But since there is no teacher around to give us grades, you know, saving 1,000,000 years is a great boon to society for us, and we should do it. And I think definitely it's quite likely that a lot of civilizations could have been much more advanced than we are because they had more time. We developed our technologies only over the past century or so, the modern science and technology. Most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun. So if some of them had similar history and, you know, produced in, technological civilizations like us, then it could have happened billions of years ago. And anything they sent into space, any advanced computers or technology, that such equipment would be found by us. You know, it's just like searching for when you go on the beach. Most of the time you see rocks that are naturally produced, but every now and then you might see a plastic bottle. And that indicates that a civilization exists out there.
Yes, if they exist and we encounter them, or as you said in your book, we have to maybe found a new discipline, which is astroarchaeology, and maybe also astrolinguistics and astrotheology and whatnot. Professor, I read also that you liked existential philosophers. Humankind all the time wondered about the meaning of life. Life seems to be absurd, and maybe it is, I don't know, but would it be less absurd if we find out that we are not alone in the universe? And is it better maybe to be alone or not? Like what happens when we meet them? We go into war?
Well, it's not up to us, obviously. I mean, reality is whatever it is. And my daughters tended to think that they are the smartest, they are the center of the world when they were at home at a young age. And once we took them to the kindergarten, they got a better perspective. And obviously, it was a psychological shock to recognize there are other kids, and some of them are smarter than my daughters. But it's part of reality. So we should adapt to whatever reality we find around us and make the best out of it. Rather than ignore it. I think the worst we can do is simply say, we know the answer, we don't need to look. In terms of what we might find, I think it's very likely that we will first encounter equipment rather than biological creatures, because they cannot survive the long journeys through space. There is a lot along the way that. And fundamentally, we are born into this world like actors that are put on a stage without knowing what the play is about. And one thing we see when we look at the universe is that the stage is huge. It's 10 to the power 26 times bigger than our body. And also the play has been going on for 13.8 billion years. And we just came at the end. So clearly the play is not about us. And that should give us a sense of modesty. And one way to approach it is to try and find other actors. Perhaps they have a better idea on what the play is about.
Professor, 1 minute about the Starshot initiative, because I find it so fascinating. What point are we?
Yeah, so this is the project to visit the nearest star system using a light sail that is pushed by a very powerful laser beam. And currently we have many groups, experimental groups, working on three main aspects of the project. One is the photon engine, the laser beam, creating an array of small lasers that are combined to make a powerful beam. And that's a major challenge. The second is the sail, and there are many groups working on the kind of material that we may want to use and the shape of the sail. And finally, communication. That's also extremely important, given that the distance to the nearest star is 4 light years. So it's a very large distance, and if the spacecraft sends back a signal, it's not easy to detect it. It will be very faint. We are talking about a light sail that weighs of the order of grams, being pushed by a very powerful laser beam, 100 gigawatt, for a few minutes across a distance that is 5 times the distance to the moon. And that would allow it to reach a fifth of the speed of light, so that it can get to the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, within 20 years or so, within our lifetime. Because if we use the reason is, if we use chemical rockets, the type of rockets we've used before, with New Horizons, with Voyager, it would take about 50,000 years to reach the nearest star. And that's the time that elapsed since the first humans left Africa. It's a very long time. And we are not that patient.
Very exciting. I want to finish with a quote from your book that says, "As I watch colleagues close ranks against the serious consideration of the hypothesis that Oumuamua could be extraterrestrial technology, I often wonder what happened to our childhood curiosity." So everybody can answer to himself or herself to this question. And Professor Loeb, it was a great pleasure. Thank you very much. And I would like to remember also your book, Extraterrestrial, the First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth. And you can find also the link to the book in the description here.
Thank you for hosting me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you to all. Please share and like StarViews and turn your gaze to the sky. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.